Welcome to Crown TV. Immerse yourself with a captivating audio from our stories. We provide an alternative way to read books in audio. We upload many audiobooks as possible, from bestsellers to timeless classic. Subscribe and stay tuned for new upload.
Episode 331, Quest for Revenge. "Lee!" Tyson roared. The power of his voice stopped Lee in his tracks. He turned to his leader, and his eyes were filled with a confusing mixture of rage and joy, sadness and disappointment. The news of Alex's death tore through him. "I understand how you feel," Tyson said comfortingly. "And you will get a chance to use your energies, even if it's not to take revenge on Alex yourself. When we go back east, you can inflict all the pain you like." Lee's anger turned to anticipation. "So, when do we go?" he asked and clenched his fists. "I want to destroy them. They killed Damon, just like they killed Julie. History repeats itself. We must take revenge." Tyson shared the sentiment, but he gestured at Lee to calm down. "I know you're itching to go," he said, "but we're not ready. I need a little more time to prepare. It won't be long. And then we'll strike such a blow that the entire martial arts community on the East Coast will topple over." Tyson smiled. He had been preparing his body and mind for this event for a long time. He was very close. Once he had perfected his skill, nothing could stop him. Then he would lead the assault on the East Coast. He had pictured it many times. They would be like a winter storm descending on the fallen leaves, breaking them apart and scattering them to the wind. All those who had wronged the Blood Brothers in the past would be hunted down and destroyed, and the eastern region of the United States would come under their control. "Martial arts is a joke over there," he thought. "There's no direction, no cohesion. Everyone does what they want. It's just a game. Something to do for fun. They need real discipline, and I'll give it to them." "How long until you're ready?" Lee asked anxiously. "If I'm given the space to focus, no more than a month," Tyson said. "After that, nobody will be able to stop us." "A month," Lee thought. "I can't wait that long. I'll go insane." "I request permission to go to Baltimore myself," he exclaimed. "I'll begin the process on my own." Tyson gave him a quizzical look. "Alone?" he asked. "Yes," Lee answered. He straightened his back and stood with confidence. "Nobody over there can match me. If I go myself, I can work more effectively. And if I target the right people, I can cut off the head before the rest of you arrive to devour the body." Tyson thought about it. He couldn't think of anyone who could stand up to Lee in the East. Most of the real threats were growing old, and he would be able to knock them down easily. And once they were gone, the rest would drop like flies. Besides, he thought, Lee is known to be one of us. His actions will teach them to fear us. When we make our move, the mere whisper of our name will drop them to their knees. Lee's idea made sense. "All right," he said. "It's up to you to decide. But if you go, you must not embarrass the Blood Brothers. Work carefully, and don't take unnecessary risks. Once my preparations are complete, I'll check in on your progress." Lee was overjoyed. "Thank you," he said. He walked over to Tyson and bowed to him. "I swear that I'll live up to your confidence in me. I'll crush them for you, and I'll let you know when the time is right for you to come. Once you join me, they'll all grovel before us." "Good," Tyson said calmly. "Before you go, I'll send a message to every martial arts organization on the East Coast. I'll let them know we're coming. And when you arrive, they'll be trembling like leaves." "As you say," Lee said, and bowed to his leader once more. The next day, Tyson sat down to compose his email. It was to be sent to the biggest and most influential martial arts gangs in the eastern region of the United States. The news would spread to everyone, even remotely connected to the martial arts community. The letter read, 100 years ago, the martial arts community of the northeast area of the United States staged a cowardly attack on the founder of our organization. More than 100 of us were killed, and our founder was forced to take refuge on the other side of the country where he died. This is a debt that must be paid in blood, and the blood that is required to satisfy us is enough to fill the oceans. We are the Blood Brothers. Our founder was betrayed by the gangs of the East Coast. They demolished his life's work, and the pain of it tore life itself from him. But we live on, and we have not forgotten. Starting today, the Blood Brothers demand retribution from the descendants of those who committed this great wrong. Lee Harshaw, our representative on the East Coast, is coming to collect. There will be nowhere to hide. Through him, our fury will descend upon you, and our vengeance will spread death and desolation across your lands. Our assault against all traitors will hang like a flaming sword over your heads until the blood debt has been paid in full. When Tyson was done writing, he clicked send and leaned back in his chair. The war had begun. News of Tyson's message quickly spread across the eastern seaboard. However, the news did not reach the Moon Palace. No one from the Appalachian region had participated in the attack against Hujuli, and the letter had not been sent to anyone in the region. For the time being, Alex and the others at the temple remained unaware of what was happening. The rest of the Northeast was in a state of convulsion. Every gang and martial arts group in the area began preparing for the assault. Some were defiant. Others were overjoyed. Many were scared and disappointed that the peace would be broken. Many of the major gangs remained calm. The sentiment of Tyson's letter was not news to them. A confrontation with the Blood Brothers had been expected for many years. Now that the time had come, they were prepared. On the day after the email was sent, Art Stedman was sitting in his office when his phone rang. He accepted the call. It was Tyson. "Mr. Stedman," Tyson began, "in 2 days, our East Coast representative Lee Harshaw is coming back to Baltimore. I hope that he can count on your assistance." "Yes, of course," Art said joyfully. In his mind, it could be only a good sign that Tyson was sending Lee back. "If I may ask, is this the first step of your return to the East?" "It is," Tyson answered blankly. Art was overjoyed. Tyson said nothing more. Instead, he hung up the phone and called Lee. "I've spread the word about your arrival," he told him. "You'll be on a plane to Baltimore in 2 days. When you get there, Art Stedman will receive you." "Thank you, Tyson," Lee replied. "I'll start preparing tonight." "Very good. I will send you a list of those groups that took part in the attack on our founder. We'll target their descendants. Once you arrive, you can start picking them off. How and in what order is up to you." Tyson hung up the phone. He was standing in front of a brand new building in the headquarters of the Blood Brothers. He put the phone away and went inside. He had spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the new training facility, and he had spared no expense on the latest and most advanced technology. The new facility housed equipment and training areas that utilized lasers and nanotechnology, and it also contained more traditional features like spiritual grass, water areas, and elixirs. It was Tyson's pride and joy, a beautiful mixture of the old and the new. But more than anything else, it was the perfect place to prepare oneself for war, and the training room in the core of the building was the best of all. Tyson walked deep inside the building until he came to the door to the central training room. The two disciples stood guard outside it. Tyson pressed his hand to the fingerprint scanner, and the metal door opened. The air from inside the room rushed through the doorway onto his face. He could feel the aura of the place, its spirit. The two disciples could feel Tyson's spiritual joy. The very atmosphere seemed to improve them more than months of hard training ever could. Tyson saw them looking at him. "Disciples," he said with a reassuring firmness. "I expect that Lee will quickly subdue Baltimore. Then we will join him, and together we will conquer the East Coast." He went inside. Meanwhile, Lee was finishing a training session on the frozen lake. When he was finished, he walked from its center towards the edge. When he felt stone underneath his toes, he stopped and closed his eyes. "Damon," he thought, "I will avenge you. I'll make them pay for the price of blood for all their crimes. I swear it." As he thought these words, his whole body stiffened. His internal force intensified. Suddenly, the thick ice on the surface of the lake broke beneath his feet. Deep cracks shot out in a half circle behind him. A hole opened up at its center into the water below, but Lee didn't fall in. He stood above it with only his toes on the edge, and the strain only increased his determination to complete his task. Episode 332, Beginning of Trouble. Early the next morning, Lee and 6 hand-picked men got on a private plane and flew to Baltimore. While they were in the air, he looked over the list of names that Tyson had given him intently. He studied their locations and decided on a good place to set an example. He decided on Pennsylvania. They landed at 10 o'clock. When Lee stepped out of the plane onto the runway, he saw that Art and Chris were waiting for them. They came forward and greeted Lee enthusiastically. "Hello, Mr. Harshaw," Art said, and gestured to his car. "Please come with me. I've already made arrangements for you." "I'm grateful, Mr. Stedman," Lee answered, "but I'd like to pay my respects to my fallen comrades first." "Of course. I'll take you there immediately," Art said. Art, Chris, and Lee walked over to the car, and they drove to a cemetery in the outskirts of Baltimore. It was a cold and windy day, and the grass and the trees were beginning to wither and lose their color. It was a desolate scene. Art showed Lee where Damon had been buried. He had been given a large tombstone with the inscription, "Here lies Damon Walker, our brave and righteous brother in blood." Lee couldn't contain his grief. He started crying, staggered forward, and wrapped his arms around Damon's tombstone. It was as if he was embracing him again. The chill of the cold stone against his cheek only intensified the fire of vengeance in his heart. "Damon," he whispered, "the one who killed you may be dead, but many more of our enemies remain. I will spill their blood for you. You just wait and see. I'll send them to wherever you are, and you can fight forever in the afterlife." He wiped the tears from his eyes and turned to look at Art. "Mr. Stedman, I need you to get me a flight ticket to Philadelphia. I'm not here for fun, and I want to start as soon as possible." "Yes, of course," Art replied respectfully. "The Blood Brothers will return to the East Coast shortly," Lee said. "As long as you remain loyal, we'll help you take back what you've lost." "Thank you," Art said sincerely. "We're looking forward to your return, and we'll do whatever we can to help you." They got back in the car, and Art made a few calls to arrange a plane ride to Philadelphia. After a night's rest in Baltimore, Lee boarded a plane to Philadelphia. Art said he wanted to go with him, but he couldn't leave on account of his position. Instead, he sent Chris along. When they arrived in Philadelphia, Art had arranged for local officials to drive them to the Black Swallow Martial Arts Academy just outside the city. Lee kept his eyes closed for the entire car ride. All he could think of was how he would barge into the academy and make himself known. "The Blood Brothers are coming," he would say. "Now you will all pay your debts." At the Black Swallow Academy, a much-anticipated ceremony was about to begin. Zachariah Holbrook, the academy's headmaster, was about to emerge from 8 months of self-imposed isolation. It was a punishment he had forced upon himself for the shame of having to expel his favorite student. The rumor was that he had spent the time in intense mental and physical training. Everyone at the academy waited nervously for him to appear. The staff and the most accomplished students waited in the great training hall, and the rest of the students were gathered in the courtyard outside. The air was filled with tension. Everyone wanted to know what the master would say and do. The sound of a door opening rang out across the hall. But the master's chambers remained sealed. From a door on the other side, a middle-aged man came wobbling into the hall with heavy footsteps. His eyes were sunken, his nose cracked, and his loose, pale skin hinted at the previous injury. As he approached the center of the hall, every eye in the academy followed him. He was the expelled favorite student of Zachariah. He was Cliff Munson. Cliff had been seriously injured by Alex at David's wedding ceremony. He had broken several ribs, and there had been severe damage to his internal organs. The hospital couldn't help him, so he had been taken back to the academy. With the help of their herbs and ancient healing practices, he had survived. But Zachariah had not been told. He had been in isolation, and there had been no time to lose if Cliff's life was to be spared. Today, they would all find out the master's feelings on the matter. Cliff walked up to the front and waited with the others. A muffled noise came from inside the master's chamber. Everyone stood up more attentively. The time was coming. They heard the sound of footsteps approaching the other side of the door. It swung open, and Zachariah stepped outside. He was an old man, but powerful for his age. His hair was white with a few remaining streaks of black, and the wrinkles on his face hinted at a long and eventful life. He looked calm and at peace. The people closest to him rushed up to receive him. "Master, you've returned to us," one of them cried. Another ran out onto the courtyard and called out, "The master has come out." The courtyard exploded in cheers, and cheers of Zachariah's name soared up into the sky. Zachariah looked content and peaceful, but then his eyes fell on Cliff. He could only bring himself to say a single word. "You." The memories and hurt came rushing back to him. He remembered how Cliff had been sneaking off to brothels behind his back. It was not something he could tolerate, so he summoned Cliff to face judgment. He had been forced to expel him. Cliff had broken his heart so thoroughly that he had gone into complete isolation for 8 months, and now here he was again. Cliff could see the pain in his eyes. "Master, please, allow me to speak before you say anything," he said and went down to his knees. "I know that I was wrong. I know I betrayed you. I beg your forgiveness." Zachariah looked down at his old pupil, and Cliff stared back at him pleadingly. If his master didn't let him back, he would be in deep trouble. When he had been expelled, he had thought that he could live on his own reputation. But Alex had beaten him and destroyed that reputation. Without the protection of the Black Swallows, he was as good as dead. Besides, he needed time and a place to practice. Zachariah looked around him. From the looks on his students' faces, it was clear that they sympathized with Cliff. He stood like that for what seemed like an eternity, careful not to betray his thoughts. "Please, give me another chance," Cliff said. "I swear, I'll never let you down again." Zachariah sighed. In his isolation, he had practiced calm, forgiveness, and goodwill towards all life. Those feelings remained with him even now. He smiled leisurely and said, "I will select a number of our most important texts, and you will transcribe them 100 times. Cliff didn't care about the punishment. He was ecstatic that Zachariah had accepted him back. He crept forward and took his master's hand. "Thank you, master," he said. "I promise to reward your faith in me." Zachariah smiled and gave him a faint nod. Then he turned to the other people who stood around them. "What has happened in the world since I went away?" he asked. He had been isolated for 8 months. There was no use in wasting time before getting caught up. "Many things, master," one of his disciples said. "First of all, Cliff was seriously injured in a fight. He almost died, so we brought him back here. But he refuses to tell us who it was that beat him." "Is that so?" Zachariah asked and looked at Cliff with confusion. He had trained him and watched him for many years. If there was someone out there who could beat him so easily, he wanted to know who it was. "There has also been a fight between the Clifton and Stedman families for control of Baltimore," the disciple continued. "The Stedmans got Damon Walker to fight for them. He was a member of the Blood Brothers from California. Right before the fight, he easily killed Paul Novak, but he lost the fight and was killed. An unknown fighter called Alex defeated him." Zachariah raised his eyebrows. The surprises just kept coming. Paul was one of the few who he knew stood a chance against Cliff. If this Damon could beat Paul so easily, he thought, then how could he have allowed himself to lose to this Alex? "There's one more thing, master," the disciple said with a heavy voice. "The Blood Brothers have sent a message to every major gang on the East Coast. They're after revenge against those who have wronged them in the past, and one of them is coming soon. He's probably already here." Episode 333, The Coming of War. The disciple took out his phone. "This is it," he said, and opened up a text file. He showed it to Zachariah. "This is the message. Tyson Slade has declared war on the East Coast." Zachariah read the letter carefully, and his face grew dark. "It's worse than war," he said. The Blood Brothers are preparing for a massacre. Master, is it true that our people also participated in the attack on Hujuli? Another of Zachariah's students asked nervously. What happened back then? Zachariah studied their worried faces. For years, students and teachers at the academy had asked him about those events, but he had refused to answer. Now that war had been declared, perhaps the time had come for openness and honesty. It never made sense to me, Cliff interjected. From what I've heard, Hujuli was respected by everyone. And then, suddenly he was branded as a threat and thrown out. Martial arts training is supposed to be about inner peace and self-defense. Why did the old masters turn on him and his family? Someone once told me that Hujuli's ambition made him dangerous, and that had justified the action against him, he continued. But that doesn't seem right. Zachariah thought about it. He walked over to a window and looked out. The sky was clear and blue, and sparrows were playing in the air outside the window. He sighed. People thought differently 100 years ago, he said pensively. Those were troubled times, and some of the principles that we hold dear were temporarily abandoned. Cliff and the others nodded. They understood what Zachariah meant, but they needed to know more. Zachariah's face hardened. Hujuli founded the Blood Brothers to avenge his family and kill those responsible for their fate, he said, shifting the subject. Many on the East Coast have watched them for a long time. Their numbers have grown rapidly, and they are now the largest gang on the West Coast, with an international reputation. Obviously, Tyson now feels that he can make his move. We must make ours. One of Zachariah's disciples stepped forward and asked, Master, did you gain any insights from your isolation? Yes, Zachariah answered. I had a lot of time to contemplate and train. I have mastered ancient knowledge and techniques that I didn't fully understand before. With time, I'll teach them to all of you. He raised his eyes and stood taller. Step forward, my favored 7. 7 of the most accomplished students at the academy came forward and stood around Cliff. They looked to their master with eager anticipation. My honored disciples, Zachariah said with a smile. To start with, I'll instruct the 7 of you on the key points of what I've learned. I will also find the time to give lectures on classical texts to all our students. I have many new things to say. Cliff and the 7 disciples nodded gratefully to him. When the Blood Brothers come, we'll have nothing to fear, one of the disciples exclaimed. With our master leading us, they're not a threat. And besides, they're only sending 1 man. Don't underestimate the enemy, Zachariah cautioned. We must get back to training. We need to be... As he spoke, he was interrupted by a loud clang and the sound of wood breaking. Zachariah, Cliff, and the 7 disciples rushed out of the hall into the courtyard. On the other end, they could see that the gates into the academy had been smashed. The students closest to it had been thrown aside, and several men in dark clothes came walking into the academy. At the head of them walked a large-bodied, middle-aged man with a fierce expression on his face. He wore a black suit and carried himself with steady confidence. Beside him walked a younger, more handsome man who was half a head taller than his companion. A few feet behind them came a group of 6 young people, whose clothing and demeanor matched the older man exactly. It was clear they were working for him. The 2 men in front were Lee and Chris. "How dare you come into the Black Swallow Academy like this?" the oldest and most senior of Zachariah's disciples shouted at them. "Who are you?" Lee stopped and smiled. "I'm Lee Harshaw." Zachariah, Cliff, and the others were shocked. Nobody had suspected that he would arrive so soon. "So you're Lee," Cliff said and stepped forward. He looked derisively at Lee. "You've overstepped your bounds, pal. Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson." Cliff saw his chance to redeem himself in the eyes of his brethren, and he decided to seize it. He stared at his opponent and got into a fighting position. He was ready. He rushed at Lee. He was almost fully recovered from his fight with Alex, and he descended on Lee with terrible speed. He struck at his stomach. The blow landed, and Lee gave off a slight gasp. While his feet stayed firmly on the ground, his body jolted backward and absorbed the blow. Cliff was secretly impressed. Such a blow could only be absorbed by an extraordinarily resilient fighter. Lee hadn't even tried to parry it. Most men would have keeled over. While Lee was readjusting, Cliff went in for a series of quick blows. He came at Lee with 10 attacks in lightning-fast succession. But Lee blocked every one of them. "Is that all?" Lee sneered and threw his fist at Cliff. Cliff stepped to the side to dodge the blow, but he was unprepared for its strength and speed. As he twirled around, Lee's fist struck him on the shoulder with a crunch. He staggered back a few meters, and he saw that the stone floor had cracked where he had stood. The other disciples could tell that Cliff was struggling to match Lee, and they all rushed to his side. When they reached his side, they spread out in a line across the courtyard. "Hold positions," one of them yelled. They knew that they must stay coordinated, or they might disrupt each other's flow. If they worked cohesively, they had no doubt that they would stop the intruders. With a signal from the eldest disciple, who stood in the middle, the others stepped forward to create a half circle around Lee. This defensive move was a special technique that had been taught at the temple for several generations. It relied on teamwork to force the opponent to expose himself by parrying. Cliff and the disciples had trained extensively together. They had mastered this technique a long time ago, and they could perform the synchronized attacks in their sleep. As they slowly moved on Lee, they stared him down with complete confidence in victory. Lee seemed amused. "So, the Black Swallows have gained their reputation by ganging up on people," he said. "And here I thought that I would have to face fighters with actual skill." He started laughing hysterically. Episode 334, Coming to a Head. Cliff and the disciples were incensed. "We'll do whatever's necessary to throw out scum like you," one of them shouted in anger. "Now leave before you get hurt." Cliff smiled menacingly. "You think I'm afraid of your little tricks?" he said, and assumed a defensive posture. The most senior of Zachariah's disciples gave the signal to attack, and they all moved forward to begin their assault. They moved in perfect unison, each one attacking just as another retreated. Their blows came from all directions in a pattern designed to make successful parrying impossible. It was a technique designed to overwhelm. However, against all odds, Lee held them off. His training was based on defensive moves, and he had spent many years preparing his body and reflexes for an attack by multiple assailants. He seemed to move at the speed of light, twisting and contorting his limbs in impossible ways in order to defend himself. Cliff and the disciples were shocked. They had never seen the like. They had not been afraid of the Blood Brothers before, but fear was starting to grow in them. Lee was only one man, but his defensive skills seemed almost superhuman. If the Blood Brothers had such skill among their ranks, then facing the whole group would surely be a hopeless task. "Are we done with the warm-up?" Lee said as he took a step back from their assault. "Want to fetch a drink?" He stared the disciples down. They were panting from the strain of the attack, and beads of sweat glimmered on their foreheads. Lee was calm and collected. It was as if the fight had not even begun for him. "Enough of this," he said with scorn. "Let me show you how to fight for real." There was no pause after he had spoken. He immediately leapt into the air and kicked the senior disciple in the chest. The disciple crossed his arms to protect himself, but there was no time. Lee's foot struck him in the sternum with a crunch, and he flew backward and fell onto the stonework a few meters away. He lay there, unable to get up, and coughed up a mouthful of blood. Lee quickly turned to the others and unleashed a frenzy of kicks on all of them. It was too fast to defend against, and in a few moments, they were all lying on the ground with broken bones and bloody faces. The other disciples of the academy came forward to help their wounded brothers. As Lee stood over them with a mocking smile, the disciples lifted them off the ground and carried them into the academy. As they passed Zachariah, he looked at them with pity. He clenched his fists and fixed his eyes on Lee. They were full of hatred and despair. Lee met his eyes and laughed. "You boast about being the best, but I guess not," he said. Then he suddenly became very serious. "You know why I'm here, Zachariah. Our founder's family was betrayed and murdered, and your old masters were in on it. You have a blood debt to us, and I'm here to collect." He sneered. "Why didn't you come out to greet me yourself?" "Well, perhaps it was a smart move. You saw what happened to your little students. But with you, I won't be so gentle. The debt must be repaid, and I think your head would cover it." Zachariah grew angry at Lee's arrogance. "You have inherited the arrogance of your founder. Julie's ambition was a threat to everyone around him. He needed to be stopped. But he survived. And now you come here to continue his legacy of destruction. But I will stop you," Zachariah screamed. Zachariah focused his internal energy. He channeled all his anger and fear, concentrating it into focused energy with which he could assail his opponent. Without saying another word, he rushed towards Lee. "About time, old man," Lee thought. "Let's see what you've got." Lee came forward to meet him, and their clash was like the crashing of two storm clouds. Zachariah was a more formidable opponent than even 7 of his students had been, and Lee required all his energy and focus to deal with him. His attacks were paradoxical and puzzling. His attacks were frenzied and deliberate. His movements were fast and slow, and his contacts with Lee were as hard as they were soft. It was a style that he had studied for many years, and he had finally mastered it during his isolation. The idea was to create confusion, to make your opponent feel as if you're doing everything at once. A hard blow can be diverted, and a soft blow can be blocked. But when the attack is both at the same time, the choice of a proper defense becomes impossible. Lee was a master of defense, but Zachariah could tell that he was struggling. It was working. He went in for the final blow. With both fists clenched, he struck at Lee's chest with unimaginable speed. But he had made a mistake. Using both hands to strike at the same spot was risky. If this attack landed, its force would topple the opponent. But its focused nature worked against the confusion his technique relied on. The success of the blow depended on the opponent being sufficiently bewildered already. Lee was not. Zachariah's attacks confused him, but he was an expert in defensive techniques. He sensed ahead of time that Zachariah was going for the final blow, and he easily stepped aside. Then he swiped at his opponent's legs. Busy with his own attack, Zachariah had no hope of avoiding the counterattack. His legs buckled, and he fell to the ground. "Die, old man," Lee said, and moved to stomp Zachariah's head into the ground. Zachariah narrowly avoided death. He moved his head away from where Lee struck his foot into the stone, rolled away from him, and stood back up. Then, one of his students called out to him and threw him a sword. He caught it in the air and immediately went for the attack. Lee reacted quickly. In the corner of his eye, he could see that other students in the courtyard held swords. He rushed up to one of them and grabbed his sword from its scabbard. As he drew it and swung around, the two swords clashed together with a loud clang. Sparks flew. Zachariah smiled faintly. He deflected Lee's sword and shoved his own into his shoulder. Lee cried out in pain. "I'll take you with me, old man," he said. Then he lifted his sword and plunged it into Zachariah's chest. Both men collapsed onto the ground. Lee stumbled to his feet, but Zachariah could not. He had been stabbed in the heart. He tried to get onto his knees, but he quickly fell back down. He gasped for air. Lee picked up his sword and stood over Zachariah with disdain in his eyes. Without speaking, he raised his arm, and there was a flash of light in the autumnal sun, and Zachariah's head left his body. Lee lifted his face to the sky and closed his eyes. "Founder," he said solemnly, "the revenge for your betrayal has begun. One by one I will bring tokens of their defeat to your tomb in your honor." He bent down and used the sword to cut Zachariah's robe from his body, complete with the emblem of the Black Swallows. As he walked across the courtyard and disappeared out of the gate with his men, the academy was left in stunned silence. For what seemed like an eternity, Not a sound nor movement was made in the courtyard, but for the swallows dancing in the sky above. Having dealt swiftly with Zachariah, Lee wasted no time in spreading his revenge across Pennsylvania. Chris took him across the state to hunt down everyone who shared in the blame for Hu Julie's fate. Lee defeated them all, and everywhere he gathered tokens to be brought to his father's tomb. When he crossed off every name in the state from his list, Lee asked Chris to send out a message for him. Lee called for a meeting of the martial arts groups at Silver Lake in Baltimore. It was to be held in 10 days. Every descendant of Hu Julie's betrayers must attend, where they could expect a visit from Lee. And if anyone wished revenge for what had been done in Pennsylvania, Lee made sure to add they could find him at Silver Lake. In just a few days, the news spread all over the East Coast. The news of what had happened in Pennsylvania caused an uproar in the martial arts community, and Lee's letter created furious debate. Many wanted to go to Silver Lake to kill him. Others wanted to go and hear what he had to say. Respected leaders and elders in the community made statements in which they declared that anyone who chose to go to the meeting would not be faulted for doing so. A few days before the meeting was to take place, Jessup got the news. A few weeks earlier, he had received a phone call from Alex and Debbie. They had told him that Debbie's condition was under control, but that she needed to stay in the Appalachians for another month before she was fully recovered. Jessup knew what the actions of the Blood Brothers meant. It wouldn't be long before they returned to the East Coast. The situation was very dangerous, but he chose not to tell Alex about Lee's actions. If he had, Debbie might become worried for the safety of the family. And if she left the mountains and came back to the city, it could be very bad for her. Episode 335. Anticipation all over. The day before the meeting arrived. It was the day before New Year's Eve, and representatives from all the major martial arts organizations on the East Coast came to Baltimore. Many of them were among those who the Blood Brothers blamed for what had happened to their founder. There had been fierce discussions about whether they should go, but every one of them had decided that worse things might happen if they didn't. Besides, there was a widespread outrage about what had happened to Zachariah and the others, and the meeting might provide an opportunity to get revenge on Lee. More than anything else, however, they were united in the desire to preserve the integrity of the practice of martial arts, along with its continued existence. The hotels of Baltimore filled up with representatives of the martial arts organizations. In his room at the Four Seasons Hotel sat Brody Kent, the leader of the Sunrise sect. He had just finished his daily meditation and sat at the table drinking tea. He was lost in deep contemplation at what might transpire at the meeting. A young member of the sect was standing behind him. It was Brody's attendant. He looked nervous but determined. "Master," he said, "will we get a chance to kill the murderer tomorrow?" Brody sighed. "I don't know," he answered. "He killed Zachariah and the others. We must not underestimate him. But as one of the major sects in this part of the country, we are duty-bound to stop this blood brother, just like we drove out his predecessor." He paused and sipped some tea. "I just don't know if we can," he muttered. He didn't want to admit it, But he knew that the talents and resources of the Sunrise sect had decreased considerably in recent years. Even his skills could not hope to match his predecessors. It was the sad truth of martial arts in the United States. There was no interest in such traditions anymore. All anyone cared about was celebrity gossip and the newest shiny trinket. "The tea is gone cold," he said, changing the subject. "And this blend is undrinkable. Go and ask the staff if they have any other ones." The young man turned and went to find the hotel staff, leaving Brady alone with his thoughts. In another part of town, a man was sitting on a bed in another hotel room. His name was Grayson Ashbury, the leader of the Pouncing Leopard martial arts school, and he was also thinking about the coming confrontation with Lee. His wife sat beside him. She was trying to calm him, but he was nervous and tense. "Honey, please just promise me you won't start a fight with him," she said. "This man is a greater threat than any you faced before. You could get yourself killed." Grayson sighed and tried to smile at her, but he could not hide his sadness. His wife knew very little about martial arts, though she always supported him. But this time even she knew that he was outmatched. "And if I don't stand a chance," he thought, "is there anyone who does?" In yet another room in another hotel, a dignified middle-aged woman sat stoically in a chair. Her name was Belinda Hawkins, and she was the leader of the Iron Fist sect. Several of her disciples, all of them young women, sat on the floor around her. She was preparing them for what was to come. "Tomorrow's battle will be a great opportunity for us," she said. "We've never been shown the respect that we deserve. Despite our strength and skill, we've always been marginalized." She smiled and looked into all their faces. "And we know why that is, don't we?" The disciples looked at each other and nodded. "It's because we're women," one of them said. "The others are almost all men. Of course they won't accept that we're as good as they are." Her name was Melody, and she was the eldest and most senior of Belinda's disciples. Belinda smiled. "You're right, Melody," she said. "But now we have a chance to prove ourselves. Lee Harshaw is very powerful. Not even the leader of the Sunrise sect will be able to defeat him." "But if Brody Kent can't match him, how could we do any better?" another disciple exclaimed. "We have to be cunning on our side," Belinda said somberly. "We'll hold our ground and let the men fight first. Lee's powerful, but there's only so much a man can take. Even if he is victorious, he will get tired. That's when we'll step forward, and I'll strike him down myself. Then, the Iron Fist sect will be the saviors of U.S. martial arts," Melody said, finishing her leader's thought. "The other gangs will be forced to recognize us. We'll be the first martial arts group in the country, and no one will dare disagree." Belinda nodded with satisfaction. One of the younger disciples looked displeased. "I thought we were here to protect the martial arts community," she said. "I'm sorry, but this plan seems selfish." The atmosphere in the room changed completely. The other disciples stared tensely at her, flabbergasted that she would say such a thing. "What are you saying?" Melody asked sternly. "Who are you to question our leader?" "I didn't mean it like that," the younger disciple responded. "Well, then be quiet," Melody said sternly. Belinda raised her hands and gestured to them to stop arguing. She leaned forward and addressed the one who had questioned her. "I understand your objection, But I promise you that I have not forgotten the greater purpose. That's why we're all here. She paused and leaned back before continuing. But if I can improve our status at the same time, then I'll do it. I understand, the younger disciple said. She seemed satisfied by Belinda's answer. Conversations like these were happening all over Baltimore. The city was overflowing with nervous anticipation. For those who knew about it, the upcoming meeting was a ticking time bomb that threatened to set fire to the whole eastern seaboard. Of course, the vast majority of people were completely unaware. For them, life went on just as before, with no awareness of the danger they were in. On the following day, there were New Year's celebrations all across the city. A spirit of renewal gripped the city, and firework displays danced across the early evening sky. In the distant Appalachian Mountains, the atmosphere at the Moon Palace was equally festive. Decorations had been set up, a massive feast had been prepared, and Alex and Debbie stood on a stage in front of everyone. Since they were the lord and lady of the palace, it was one of their duties to deliver a speech. Today is the first New Year's that Debbie and I spend at the Moon Palace, Alex began. While we've only been here a month, we feel as happy and welcome here as if we had lived here all our lives. We wish every one of you a wonderful evening and Happy New Year. He took Debbie's hand and led her off the stage, and they were met by applause and friendly cheers from the crowd of disciples. They had all accepted them wholeheartedly. Just as they were about to step down from the stage, Celeste came forward and held out her hand to stop them. Lord, please stay up there, she said. She looked over to the assembled crowd. I think a kiss between our Lord and his lady would be a good way to start the new year. What do you all think? The enthusiastic response of the disciples washed over them like a tsunami, and everyone in the room started chanting for Alex and Debbie to kiss. Alex and Debbie looked at each other. She blushed and lowered her eyes to the floor, but he just smiled at her and asked, Do you want to? Debbie looked back up at him, and they stared into each other's eyes. At that moment, it felt as if they had just fallen in love all over again. He leaned toward her slowly and put his lips against hers. They were sweet, soft, and warm. She met him, and he put his arms tightly around her and squeezed. She was surprised at his forwardness, but she closed her eyes and was filled with happiness.
Thank you for listening to Crown TV. Please don't forget to subscribe, share, and turn on the notification button.